This week I'm joined by Dale Brunsvold, who is an independent Rudolf Steiner researcher and founder and host of RudolfSteinerAudio.com. In this first episode on the work of Rudolf Steiner, we discuss Steiner's relationship to theosophy, the philosophy of freedom, elements of Steiner's biography, spiritual growth, and more. I'd like to say a big thank you to my paid patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. And if you would like to support Hermitix podcast, gain access to some exclusive content, and just keep the podcast running indefinitely, then please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. Dale Brunsvold, thanks very much for joining us on Hermitix podcast.
Pleasure.
So we are going to be taking on the seemingly gargantuan task of tackling an overview of the work of Rudolf Steiner, who, though, I guess now in retrospect people would say founder of Anthroposophy, but you could also say a philosopher, to a certain degree early on, a theosophist, a spiritualist, a mystic. There's a lot, artist as well, architect as well. There's a lot. And as we were just talking about before we started recording here, 480 volumes over his life, which I think is still being processed and sort of catalogued, so to speak. So this is, to go, right, we're just going to do a chat about this guy's whole work is a big task, but we'll give it a go. So before we jump in with all of this, just tell us a little bit about yourself, your work, and how you perhaps when you first came across Rudolf Steiner and whether or not it was, philosophical love at first sight.
Yes, thank you, James. So let's say, first of all, that I think at the moment there are about 360 volumes still that have been published in the German, of which only about 200 have been translated into English.
Okay.
But there are, I think, immediately another 40 that are still kind of in the works, but who knows how many decades it'll be before they come out. And I think you're right. I think there's more. I think it probably, if they got all of his notes and his letters and all that stuff eventually published, who knows how many volumes the whole thing would be. Because in those days, of course, they wrote letters a lot, right? So there's that side of it. So in 1978, I guess it was, I was living in, going to college in Moorhead, Minnesota. And I was in a graduate course in Ludwig Wittgenstein, who I still don't understand. And there was a guy at the table asking these unusual questions about percepts and concepts. And I just thought his questions were so unusual. And I asked him what he was studying, because I hadn't heard anybody use the terminology quite like that. Not that I was that versed in philosophy, really, but I love it to this day. And he slid the book, The Philosophy of Freedom, across the table. I'll never forget it. I still have that text he gave me, the white small paperback translated by Michael Wilson with the red lettering. And I got to tell you, James, I don't know what it was. It was one of those moments in your life where I saw his name, Rudolf Steiner, and it was kind of comical sounding to me. Rudolph has always been kind of, Rudolph, I suppose the red-nosed reindeer has always been kind of on my mind. But for some reason, my heart leapt for joy. I hadn't read a book. I was just looking at the cover of a book. And I was so intrigued by why am I so excited about this, And I dived into that, and I dived into his other books, and it was love at first sight in the sense of philosophically, theologically, Christologically. In so many ways, I felt, as I've said to other people before, it was like somebody was giving me back the other half of the world. Without dogma, without any kind of this is what you have to believe because it's true. But I'm a spiritual researcher. I have achieved a level of cognition that allows me to be fairly certain that what I'm providing as information is as accurate as humanly possible for me. He was very straightforward about that. And here, take it or leave it. And so that kind of freedom that he leaves you, especially imagine in the spiritual world or the religious world where we're almost it's almost implied that we're going to believe, right? And he's like, no, I don't have any relationship to that. This is what I found out. What do you think? Right. And so that's what I lived with. So about 79, I started to record the books onto cassette so I could listen to them in the car. And when I was walking, they had Walkmans, if you remember those in the old days. And then I had those. And then I would get books like from the Rudolf Steiner Lending Library, which is in America. And I still get those on a regular basis. And so I recorded mainly the Christological lectures because I think he's one of the great preachers of all time. And so anyway, then then it was the question of the world catching up with that in terms of the internet occurring, and then MP3s occurring. And then, after Napster, all these other things, if you even know anyone what any of this is, right? And then I saw one day, it just kind of came, in front of me. I'm like, oh, wait a sec, I could put Steiner on the web. So I wrote to a place called steinerbooks.org in America, which, by the way, I would like people to know, without steinerbooks.org in America and rudolfsteinerpress.com in England, we would have none of this. I can't translate German. So if they're ever thinking about, throwing money somewhere, those guys can always use it because they're they're not nonprofit kind of organizations. So, I asked permission, and a man named Gene Goligly, who has passed away in the last 2 years, gave me permission a couple months later in February of 2005. And so I really started re-recording everything by and large at that time. And so since 2005, it's the 18th year. I started the 18th year in February. And it's just been a joy, a blessing. It took maybe 10 years for it to really catch on. And then after that, it's done real well. It's gotten a lot busier, and I get a lot of emails from people, and I get to share the ideas of Steiner with people, which is a real singular joy in my life. So.
I'm intrigued. I mean, that moment for anyone is such a joy, right? To find that they're one, right? That philosopher or that thinker who they go, yeah, as you say, you found your other half, so to speak. But I mean, I'm intrigued. Has anyone else come close?
Well, I've always been kind of a gardener of the mind. I love to read the ideas of thinkers. I just do. And so, I love Soren Kierkegaard a lot. I don't know if you've ever read much of him. Teilhard de Chardin kind of blows my mind. And when I was a kid, I did go through the books that kind of cracked open all this for me when I was 17 or 18 was Carlos Castaneda, and then Carl Jung, and then Gurdjieff. So those were the three that kind of gave me a real reorientation. You're from Bismarck, North Dakota. It's a pretty conservative provincial area of the world, to say the least. And so those ideas were even more powerful in your head because they're so contrasting to everything around you. So that, I really was kind of set up. And after I read Steiner, except, Siren is wonderful to read. Teilhard is, Gurdjieff I don't find very interesting anymore. Mainly, I know, you're a Gurdjieff guy, are you?
Yeah. Gurdjieff,
I apologize. Okay, I don't want to step on anybody. But it just happens, you just sort of shed stuff. You only have enough time for enough things. But I was deeply influenced by his work, and I still really play around with it. I have all his books and, that kind of thing, and have read, seen the movie, that kind of thing. And he is impressive. But Steiner, man, I mean, it's just a whole order of magnitude beyond that kind of, in my mind, it is, because there is this thing for me. There is that, what really was amazing is that I would look at all these people, all the gurus and all the great theosophically oriented people, let's call them. And they had beautiful words. They had beautiful phrases. They had really interesting ideas. But not really any of them really showed me the money in the sense of creating these things in the world, like Waldorf Education and biodynamic agriculture, et cetera, with Steiner. And that's what really cemented for me a certain pragmatism that Steiner's spirituality gave me. And I went, wow, if you really achieve this, the world is healing. The world is better for it, rather than Dale's going to be a wonderful guy because he's going to evolve so much, which is kind of the side. A lot of that is, there's an egotism in it. Steiner, of course, talks about it a lot. He said, we have to realize this is not for us. If we do that, it's almost a kind of black magic.
Definitely. No.
In a way.
I'd agree. I mean,
yeah. And interesting, though. I would have never thought it in a million years, right? So, yeah. Am I talking too much?
No, not at all. Not at all.
Right.
It's funny that you say with Gurdjieff, you say, I don't want to tread on anyone's toes, because, I mean, that's literally what, as someone who's interested in Gurdjieff, I should be ready for that, right?
I guess that's right. The corns, stepping on your corns, right?
Exactly. But, all these thinkers, it brings me to the Hermitix question. You can place 3 thinkers, living or dead, into a room and listen in on the conversation. Steiner is already in there, and you can add 3 more. Who do you pick?
I would pick Søren Kierkegaard, Teilhard de Chardin, and Albert Einstein. And like I say, I don't really know what I would hear. I don't know if you know much about Søren Kierkegaard. Have you ever heard of him?
I've heard of Kierkegaard.
Okay,
I mean, that's on my list. But as I understand it, Kierkegaard would be he'd be quite sporadic. As I understand it, his morning drink was a cup of sugar with black coffee poured over the top.
I didn't know that.
Oh, wow.
I didn't know that. That's good. That's good.
Sludge, yeah.
But he was, of course, called the Fork because of his incredibly acerbic tongue and keen mind. And his writing is just strangely joyful to read, even if he's oddly conservative in the kind of religious sphere. Really, he kind of is, and I'm not. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't matter. His philosophical works are astonishing. He really was the inventor of existentialism. People don't realize that, but he just totally was. And his mind was just so quick and everything. So for that reason, I just like to have him in the group just to see how the other guys would handle him in a way.
How do you think Einstein would handle that room? Sorry.
Yeah, well, that's the question is how much would he listen first? You know what I mean? Because, he might, I'm just curious. I mean, he was around the same time Steiner was, and I don't know if just the concentration in his own speciality was so overwhelming that he just simply didn't ever, consider that other kind of thing at all. But I would really love those two guys just to sit there and just to see, how that would all occur. Yeah, I don't know. Just that's, I guess, the reason I'd want them together. The idea that is fascinating for me is Chardin. Have you ever read Teilhard?
I've got Let Me Explain sitting on my book pile by Teilhard de Chardin. So
okay,
yeah, it's there ready, but I haven't. He keeps coming across my path, which I generally should take as a go read him.
Well, I got to share one thing with you. I think we'll come back to it later, but he had this very interesting picture of the Christ, which in our time is so hard to find because generally he's that simple man of Nazareth, or, let's all be like Jesus, all these kind of reductive aspects rather than, well, what about the grand cosmic spiritual being? Huh? What are you talking about? That's crazy, And I'm like, well, then why do you pay any attention to the guy at all? Buddha's far more interesting, But the point with him was that he had this, right? If you know about him, he was a Jesuit priest, exiled to China for 30 years because his ideas were just too abrasive to the church. It just really bothered the church. But he was a foremost paleontologist in the world, maybe one of the 5 greatest of his time. And so here he is. He's in China. He's studying the paleontology, the land, the strata of the earth. And he finds this observation from his concrete scientific investigation that, wow, he finds a certain kind of plant at a certain layer of the earth. And he looks 1 million years later in that layer of the earth, and he finds that one plant has become 100 or 1,000 different plants, different kinds of plants, phyla and all that, whatever the right terms are. Then he looks another 1 million years, and each one of those has tangentially differentiated to another 1,000 different ones. And so he watches this, what he called tangential differentiation of evolution, like the branches of a tree growing, right? And it just shocked him how powerful it was for many, many millions of years. And then he comes to a strata of the earth, and from then on, he can't really find any of it anymore. All this tangential differentiation stops dead in its tracks. By and large, there's still vestiges of it, but compared to how it was in the past, there's nothing really. And this is in the latter tertiary period, and it is there for the first time in evolution that we find the remains of the human form. And he goes, and then my little paraphrase is, Steiner says, it's as though evolution in its intelligence had finally arrived at what it had desired all along.
Wow.
And instead of spending its passion in the differentiation of new forms, it took all its forces and began to radially converge them in the human form, so that from then on, we are evolution.
Wow.
And it's very compelling from a grounded, observational point of view, but then a priest having this kind of more expansive and imaginative intelligence to take hold of the phenomena, right, that he's seeing in a very exact way, and then kind of synthesizing this wondrous picture for us. Go ahead. I'm gabbing too much.
No, I wasn't going to say anything. I was just going to say, wow. Because that's a compatibility I probably need to look into, is that compatibility between the the evolution of man, the spiritual evolution, the ladder, and the evolution of the cosmos. And there's plenty of people who tried to tie them together, and that's a scientific way of doing that. It's very
interesting. It is, yeah. Wow. So he goes from cosmogenesis until the appearance of humanity, which is anthropogenesis, and then he says this radial convergence then creates a new space, this psychic space, this psychological space that arises in the human form, and then it evolves. And that it gets to a place, he says, where objectively then this being called the Christ seeds it with a new force that takes it further in evolution. And he claims in a certain way that this happens all over the cosmos, that all over the cosmos, this thing happens, and then the Christ enters in and seeds it to its next step in evolution. Isn't that wild? You can imagine why they kept him in China for 30 years. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I wonder if he'd even get away with it now.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure. Yeah. No, I imagine. Yeah. Wow. So, but it does tie in when we get a chance. I think it ties in interestingly from my readings over the years to Steiner's work on the philosophy of freedom, where he's talking about epistemology, how the human being comes to know, and whether or not there really is freedom, and what is the nature of freedom. Not that I have a complete grasp of those things, but they actually tie in an astonishing way, I think, with Chardin's ideas.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, we have a lot of, we have some figures there, which, as you say, I imagine that we will tie them back in. But as we jump in, there is this question, that's really difficult with Steiner in a way. I mean, situating him historically, yeah, that's a little bit easier, but situating him philosophically and spiritually, my favorite sort of Steiner anecdote is the fact that, when he's in school, he's so bored by the schoolwork, he literally has a copy of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason hidden in the schoolwork book so he can read it. But after that, as he moves into philosophy of freedom, as I understand it, really he's an autodidact almost immediately.
Yes, I think that's true in the philosophical sense, right? He got his he went to the MIT of Vienna, right, and got his probably would think of it as a master's in analytical mechanics, even though in those days, of course, this would be around 1890. I think the curriculum was very expansive and very intense. You can imagine no television, no radio. People really learned a lot. So he did learn that, shall we say, more conventionally, the scientific side of everything. But then, because of his poverty and his need to want to help his parents in helping him go to school, he then, so the argument says, and I don't know how anecdotal this is really, right, that he really taught himself Greek and Latin and studied the philosophical work anyway, right? He'd been doing that since, as you say, I think he was 11 or 12 when he started reading Kant. So he was doing that as well, and then he was tutoring his students at the gymnasium, at the liberal college, you might say, at the same time that he was doing these other things. So that is the autodidactic aspect of him. I think I agree with you on that. Even though then, when he got his PhD from Rostock, it was a PhD in philosophy. So he got a conventional one in that too, you might say. And but it was a lot loosey-gooseier in those days. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. And as you say, I mean, I think we're all sort of jealous of it now. Those older forms of education where, yeah, it would have been rigorous, but as you say, you would have learned so much, It would have been intense.
And there is an argument, too, that when we're talking, let's say, from 1890 to 1910 in Vienna and that part of the world, first of all, they had the greatest opera house in the world. Mahler was the conductor and director of that, and it was considered probably the highest point in opera music in the history of the world, really, up to now. I don't know now, right, so much. But then everything that was happening, you had Klimt, and you had the art, the secessionists, you had the philosophical work of all the great ones just kind of creaming to the top there. Yeah, and then it was kind of all blown to smithereens in 1914.
Yeah.
The fin de siècle, or however you say it properly, right? That end of an age that was so ripe with and Steiner, right, was culturally enriched and structured by possibly one of the richest cultural moments since Greece, I would argue. Okay. And that's interesting. And I think that's valuable when we think about other seekers and other seers. How much was their grounded education there, so that as they took in these spiritual experiences, they could really incorporate them, form them, and then communicate them in a very clear, distinct way. And I think most of these other people lack this. I think Steiner was preeminent in his concrete cultural development as a human being, but that's arguable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think is it Robert Musil's Man Without Qualities?
I'm reading that book. Yeah, I can't believe it. I love it. Haunting to me.
The text to document that sort of absolute spiritual and intelligence explosion in Vienna over that 20 years. And I think it's in Hans Hermann Hoppe's book on democracy, but he does that. He has this almost half a page footnote listing every single economics, music, philosophy, spirituality, like everything. You look back at that era in Vienna and you think, what was going on?
Yeah.
Seriously, where did this come from?
Yeah. And their language, even structurally, is similar to Greek, which is so fascinating in so many ways. The way the articles and stuff. Do you know German? I'm not really good at it, but I have a little bit of.
No, I don't. I'm language.
But there's an echo. There's an echo of it there. And I always think of Greece, as that incredible flowering and seeing this. Yeah, isn't that? And you're reading Musil. I just absolutely can't believe that. You've blown my mind. Isn't that cool?
Well, I'm a big fan of maximalist novels, so so there. But I mean, so philosophically it's a bit more straightforward, but spiritually is probably the more important factor, I guess. What is Steiner's sort of spiritual foundations?
Well, let's finish the other one though, because I think my opinion is that Steiner really was the end of German idealism, that he came right at that German idealism point. They were struggling with these fundamental questions. You know what? They gave up. They just set them aside right when he wrote The Philosophy of Freedom, which I think answers really a lot of those questions in a way that is challenging, no doubt. But he did. And they went, we're not interested in that anymore. We're in existentialism or Heidegger or Husserl and all these other people were around, right? And so less Heidegger, but these other people. So I just wanted to mention that I think he was still right in that stream and had finished it off. He showed Kant's shortcomings and everything in a beautiful way and all that stuff. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that I'm sort of with German idealism. After Kant, it's like, okay, there's a lot of people doing really interesting stuff, right? Schopenhauer's doing interesting stuff. I'm not a big fan of Hegel. Obviously, Steiner, his foundation, as I understand it, is more Fichte.
Yes.
But as far as I'm concerned, and this is a big thing to say, it's like this is all just a continuation of Kant and nothing fundamental breaks. It's like, oh, you've done some really cool stuff, but we're still pretty much Kantian. Maybe you disagree.
Even Steiner, you would say that.
Oh, no Steiner. I'm saying,
gotcha.
German idealism onwards. It's like, okay, you can call it German idealism, but none of you have really. You've all kept trying to say we're trying to get beyond Kant, but none of them succeed.
I think that's true. I think that is, and that's because of the presuppositions they were able to conjure up, and they just never were sufficient. And that's really where Steiner begins and really wrestles with, where can we begin this? Where is a presupposition, a set of presuppositions that will allow this to really go forward? And that's, I think, where he broke through, except that it's challenging. It's a challenging thing. But Hegel was the guy, right, who just fought against Kant right away, right? So, but like you say, was he successful is a question.
Well, everyone's still just talking about the same thing, so I imagine.
That's right.
So why do you think Philosophy of Freedom didn't really stick? Do you think, what was Steiner already seen as someone who wasn't exactly strictly philosophical at that point, someone to be a bit held at arm's length?
I don't think they knew that yet. So this was 1896, right? I believe. Maybe it was 1886. I don't remember the year the book was published. But Steiner didn't come out of the closet, as it were, until September 28th, 1900, when he gave a lecture on Goethe's Secret Revelation at the Brockdorf's little theosophical group that they had at the time. And that's when he realized as he spoke that he saw people there that were going to listen to what he had to say and we're just going to dismiss him outright. And so that was really and then they asked him to come back, et cetera, et cetera. And so that all began. But before that, he was, he was a man of letters. He ran not newspapers, but literature magazines. He was the editors of that. He was a man about town in terms of going to the theater and all that kind of stuff. So I think he was pretty respected. Yeah, I think he was. And so that book is not, except for James, the whole idea of what is that presupposition. So he said, should we talk about this now, or should we talk about spirituality?
No.
Okay. So, and I'm going to do my best on this. So if people are upset, with me, I'm always ready to be put in my place. But he said, everybody wants to say, okay, let's begin with I and the world. Let's begin with the self and the not self. Let's begin with those two things in whatever form we talk about them, right? That's how we begin a philosophical investigation. Mm-hmm. Fair enough?
Yeah.
So he says, that really all those presuppose something that nobody is taking seriously. And that something is thinking. That thinking has come into the picture somehow, some way, and it has separated the individuality of the person from the world. And he even says, there's a line in his work, he says, the human I, the human ego, lives by the grace of thinking. Now, this places thinking in a place I don't think any other philosopher has ever done.
Not even Descartes?
And maybe, okay, and I don't know enough about Descartes, so do you want to expand on that?
Well, I was just, I think a lot of people might be thinking of the I think, therefore I am, the famous quotation. But I mean, in what sense maybe does it differ, or in what sense?
So how would it differ? So this is my picture of that. And this is where we go back a little bit to that Chardin picture from before. And that is, from Steiner's spiritual experience, he looks out at the world and he sees all these formative forces, okay, in the cosmos, in the earth. These formative forces kind of penetrating matter. Now, believe it or not, I'm going to get back to what we were talking about, but this is kind of important. That these formative forces, they penetrate matter and they create all these forms, the forms of trees and animals and plants and all this stuff around us that's so amazing, right? And you could argue that when these formative forces take hold of a plant, they really spend all of their passion in bringing that form to birth and bringing about, the blossom and the seed and the fruit and everything as it goes along. Okay, here we go. But in a human being, for some reason, we are kind of a holographic resonance of the whole cosmos. Mm-hmm. We're like the easiest thing for the cosmos to create.
The easiest thing.
The easiest thing. We're the most preternatural form. We're the beginning. We're the first form of the cosmos, but in a metamorphosic way. So the whole cosmos has sort of birthed a microcosmic picture of itself in the human being. But again, we can't, how to say that because the metamorphoses are so deep for our linear sequential minds. It's, just go with me on it. Okay. So then here's the point. When these formative forces dive into matter and bring about the human form, when they're finished, they haven't spent all their passion. They have superabundance of forces left over. And those forces, think of the caduceus picture of the two snakes that are crisscrossing the staff, and then at the top they meet each other. Mm. This is my picture. Now, this is not Steiner, okay? That what happens in us is these formative forces, and only in us, these formative forces are able to turn upon themselves, and the formative forces attempt to formatively form the formative forces themselves. And when they do that, the spiritual world is able to enter onto the physical plane, and the human eye wakes up on the physical plane and is aware of the universe.
Okay.
And therefore, and what we see outside of us as these formative forces appear in us, and they are still formative forces, but we call them thinking.
Wow.
So the thinking that's happening in us is raised, right? Raised to a higher level of these formative forces, and that's what our thinking is doing all the time, right? I'm forming forms and thoughts and shapes and connecting things. I'm like a living being inside. But I wake up and I start going out into the world. Okay, so this is where I think, this is, from years of studying Steiner, that I think Steiner was trying to show that it's that thinking out there called formative forces that arises in us and creates this I in the world.
Mm-hmm. Is all thinking like that, or is it sort of a special form of thinking for Steiner?
I think that it's refined. I think, yes, absolutely. Well, then we get to this delicious picture, right? The delicious, one of Steiner's fundamental ideas that we need to touch on, of course, and that is this whole notion that, okay, well, we look out there at these formative forces in the world. Yes, we see them evolve the world, right? We have tons of evidence of the evolution of the world. But then you say, yeah, and the human consciousness, it evolves too. People go, huh? What are you talking about? Consciousness has been the same now as it was 100,000 years ago. It's just that we're smarter now. And Steiner goes, oh, no. Consciousness has been doing this magnificent, gigantic evolution as well. And if you look at every culture, you'll see them in a certain modality of consciousness in their time manifesting a culture.
Yeah. Okay.
And all of a sudden, James, the whole past of history changed for me. Now I don't have any critique, so to speak, at all. It humbles you. You go, what was the kind of consciousness that the Egyptians had? That they would relate to their social world the way they did? Well, they were just oppressed by a pharaoh in a political blah, blah, blah. And he goes, no. They were united with each other in a way you and I can't imagine. The sense of self, for instance, was very dim. But the sense of community, the sense of tribalism, whatever the word is, was fundamentally existential in their consciousness all the time. And they lived in kind of a, quite a wonderful world in that way, even though to us, they looked like they were suffering like crazy, let's say, right? Okay. So everything has to be readjusted and rethought out if Steiner's argument that an evolution of consciousness is fundamental to an understanding of history and fundamental to an understanding of the world and the human being. And I have embraced that, even though I don't know it's true.
Okay. A big question I would have is, this. Okay, so the consciousness in terms of this idea of a consciousness of a time, of a place, of a culture, and if you look back, I mean, even if you look at something like the chronology of the Bible, it's sort of seen there in that the consciousness begins with, as you say, nations or peoples, not even nations, but peoples, which then I guess as it evolves, it moves into nations and then nation states and maybe smaller and smaller until eventually, is the modern conscious one of the individual ego? What did Steiner ever say what the modern consciousness is?
Sure. I mean, that's kind of all he's talking about all the time, right? And that is what is happening in consciousness. So yeah, that I have to rethink that through a little bit. Let's let that gestate for a while. And,
okay.
And let's go back to your question about what is Steiner's spiritual lineage. Okay. So spiritually, what do we say about Steiner? It's tricky. So first of all, he had all the cultural greats. He studied Plato, Aristotle, Zarathustra, Goethe, Kant, Nietzsche, Giordano Bruno, all the mathematicians, all the scientists. All this has a spiritual aspect to it, even though we may not think that it does, right? The artists, the musicians, all that stuff. But I don't, and again, we're presuming a lot here, but eventually he met a herb gatherer on a train named Felix Kogutsky. And Felix Kogutsky apparently was some kind of a spiritual master. I'm going to say that. Nobody has any proof of this, but Steiner was intrigued by what he talked about and how he talked about nature and plants and the kind of spiritual aspect of our existence. And I think that he became a student of his in an esoteric sense, right? And eventually then came in contact with, shall we say, the masters that either were alive or not alive, that his form of consciousness as it evolved was able to access. And then, and I know I'm rushing this, so we may have to go back and unpack this more carefully. As the argument is that we have, okay, let's take a mystery in the human being, memory. What the heck is going on with that? I can remember something from yesterday. Well, that's gone. No, it's not exactly because I have a memory. I can kind of experience the past in a way, right? Mm-hmm. Et cetera, et cetera. And so, but yet I go back if I've got an amazing memory, and actually, personally, I don't, but you go back in your memory and they say, usually there's a place where you'll find you had your first memory. And before that, you have absolutely no memories, right? So there's this thing called memory that a human being can have more or less access and experience of. Now, Steiner then says, well, when you really advance in your experience of consciousness in these deeper ways, you'll actually come to a realization that's quite astonishing. And that is that the earth is a living being and it has a kind of memory. And this memory that it has is intimately connected to the activity of human beings. That we're deeply, deeply the earth, and the earth is deeply, deeply us. Okay. And that's, don't want to get too flaky about it because he's very concrete. But he says, and you can actually, at a certain point in your initiation as an initiate, you can access a memory life that the earth has. Mm-hmm. And you learn in that. You can commune with people that have died. You can commune with, scientists and musicians. You can go into the milieu of Roman culture and experience it from the inside of human souls. And this is, I think, where the evolution of consciousness sort of sprang into him, because he could do this, et cetera, et cetera. So this becomes, to me, the most fundamental aspect of his spiritual heritage. And again, it's autodidactic in its own interesting way, right? He just could absorb the wisdom of this and then take it in the modern era through his wonderful cultural foundation of growing up, in Vienna and those areas, and then begin to speak about what the world is now in relation to history. Of course, if we don't have history, what are we going to say about the present? Nothing very profound, right? We need the past to be really understood for the present to be properly understood, I think. Is that too bizarre?
No, but I mean, I guess one question is, is this, when you come to talk about these things with Steiner, for you, is it a matter of belief? Is it a matter of proven fact, of rationality? When you read these almost, to me, and the way you're explaining them, aren't coming across as arguments. He's trying to articulate something just experiential.
Experiential, you meant?
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
Yes, that's what he is doing, but that's what he's saying. Now, what do I think? Well, I'm not really a believer in anything. I don't know why I would ever want to do that, since it sounds to me like you're just giving up. And, so to me, everything I work with are ideas. And they're working hypotheses. And so you read Steiner for a while, and then you realize, wait, this picture really holds together. So it has a certain persuasiveness to it where you're like amazed by it. So maybe I'm just in thrall, right? But to say, do you know this? Do you believe this? I certainly do not. I don't even know what that actually means. I don't actually know what that word belief means. I hope I don't believe in anything, to be honest with you. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, I'm sure he's like, do you believe in the good? Well, that's like saying, do you believe in oxygen? Right? I mean, that doesn't make any sense to me. Of course, the good, you want that to be in the world. Do you believe in it? It's kind of a misuse of the word. So I would be very careful about how I would use the word. And if people could come up with a proper definition I could live with, I could maybe say I do have those kinds of things. But generally, I'm a gardener of the mind. I'm enthralled by the ideas of so many people, and Steiner just stands above them all by heads, and by many, many orders of magnitude. But I don't know if he's right. I wouldn't understand Einstein. I can read him. Do I believe him? Well, I don't even really comprehend what he's saying. I don't have the mathematical depth to kind of, you know what I'm saying? So I mean, so many things we think are obviously true, right? That we're probably only believing anyway. Right.
Yeah. Okay. So it's almost like you're. It seems you're still a believer in Gurdjieffian hypnotism, then, right? That Gurdjieffian idea of like, well, do you actually know this? Or are you just telling yourself you know it because that makes the whole structure of reality so much more simple and so much easier to take if you just say, look, I agree with this, I believe in that, etc.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe. What is it? I mean, All the world. Yeah. I don't know. That was an interesting way to put it. I'll think about it. Go ahead.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, just off that question of belief, I mean, very simple one for Steiner. Did he believe in anything?
Well, there you go. See, so what happens when, again, we're going back into an assumption of Steiner's state of mind and Steiner's modality of consciousness. What happens when, if you have a question, you can really enter into a spiritual condition where you can come to some kind of direct knowing in relation to the Christ, in relation to the spiritual world, in relation to the hierarchies of spiritual beings working into matter, etc. Into all these things. What does belief become? Mm. To you and me, belief is essentially a relationship to something we wish we knew, but we just don't know it yet, right? Mm. And I don't know if he had that condition. I'm not sure, so that's what's kind of wonderful about it. It frees you and me up when we're reading him to go, oh, that could be true, because he's not kind of desperate about it being believed. Like a lot of believers are when they want to share their ideas with you. I hope I'm not sounding that way to people.
No.
I don't mean to. We're just talking about an amazing dude, right? That's all.
Okay. Well, still staying on that line, I guess, of but moving away from belief, because I think, there is a complete understanding there of, I do understand what you mean by that, especially in relation to your own thing of just dealing with ideas, saying, you know what, let's just dive into this idea and let's just see. Let's just embroil ourselves within it and see what happens, and read and study. But
nice.
Of course, we can't really avoid the theosophy angle, and theosophy is something I've wanted to cover on the podcast and read about for a long time, because theosophy is one of these almost like a historical anomaly, not an anomaly, a historical event now, which in its time was gigantic. As I understand it, from what I've read, it was huge. It was everywhere, and as soon as it arrives in this big, becomes this big thing, it's just gone now. It seems to just have disappeared from the map. And also it's interesting that these big figures, Uspensky is another one, who get into theosophy. They get quite deeply into it. They get quite high up. And sometimes they almost, as I understand it, get initiated into those inner circles, etc. At this point, the bigger figures, Steiner, Uspensky, they leave. And so, there's a lot going on here. What for Steiner was theosophy in his life?
Yeah, that's a good one. So maybe we should give people a little picture of it. So the idea is that theosophy came into existence, the Theosophical Society, in 1875 in New York City. So that's where it was founded by Blavatsky, I believe, in Alcott. Maybe it was Ledbetter. I'm not sure of those three people who did what in a way. And, she poured forth in Isis Unveiled, and also later in The Secret Doctrine, this astonishing esoteric picture of human history, which is really quite something, right? If you ever get a chance to read a biography of her, on her, she was an amazing person, very charismatic. So what happens then is, that grows, as you said, especially like in England, it was a very big deal as well. And in Germany, let's say, but so then in 1900, when Steiner gave his talk to a theosophical group, he was not in the Theosophical Society at that time. Then over time, within a couple of years, they asked him to become the secretary of the Theosophical Society of Germany. And Steiner said, I will do this, but I will only share my own spiritual research. Mm-hmm. So, but at the same time, because he was talking to people that were theosophically, that studied Blavatsky's work, he needed to use her terminology. And he needed to use a lot of conceptual formations that she used, but almost immediately he began to try to pull those into a different direction. Mm-hmm. Okay, but they were the people that heard him. They were the people that simply were there, that were open-minded enough to consider this kind of research done by somebody. Right. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, he was, and the minute he did that, he was just forsaken by the whole entire culture that he'd been in all those other years before, which is really quite a step to take when you think about how accomplished he was becoming in that world. So Steiner then, actually, the day that he gave his inaugural talk as the secretary, that night he gave a talk on a thing called Anthroposophy to a different group of people. So he was already You know what I mean? And he didn't like Sinnott's work, like esoteric Buddhism and stuff. He felt it was very much kind of a spiritual materialism, that they were talking about these higher bodies we have as only like thinner physical bodies. They really didn't have a direct experience of the spiritual that could begin to show these different worlds, the world of the etheric, the life forces that we have, our physical. Do we need to talk about those with people, looking at what a human being is from an anthroposophical point of view? Is that too tedious?
I don't think it's too tedious, but I mean, it's interesting across, you look at any of these, the fourth way, anthroposophy and theosophy, there is always this hierarchy or structure of the human body, right?
Yeah, I mean, just taking into account more than the physical body and our ego, shall we say. Those are the two kind of bodies that, generally speaking, the world sees, as it were.
But no, I don't think it'd be too tedious to go into. No.
And so what I like about them is, so anyway, we were talking. So let's finish that thought. So then, on the other side, Steiner really, I think, was incredibly charismatic and really shocked people at the way that he could clearly bring forth these ideas. And so the society in Germany grew really, really fast and was getting quite large. Meanwhile, the Theosophical Society got more and more interested in the East. Okay, at first, Blavatsky was very much, Steiner says the first work was very Rosicrucian, was very much out of a, shall we say, Western occultism, Western esoteric tradition. Okay, but then through Besant, who became the leader later on in England, right? They moved more and more to Eastern occultists, Eastern gurus, and that type of thing, and eventually moved their entire organization over to Adyar, as you probably know, right, in India. And this was, something fine. There was nothing out and out, shall we say, wrong. I don't even know what word to say. But then I think, and I don't know, this is me kind of doing a gossip here. So I apologize to everybody trying to figure this out. So Steiner really, by 1911, had talked a lot about the nature of the Christ. And it's astonishing to read. If you ever want to read something to, get on a roller coaster, that is just so, and yet it's all biblically based later. He didn't read the Bible first. He read it afterward and shows how his spiritual investigations fit in, which is in itself kind of amazing to read, right? Sort of like somebody inventing geometry themselves and then finding Euclid and going, oh, look at that. I know that because I, found that out myself, kind of thing. So then Besant, they find Alcyon. They find this guy, Krishnamurti. And they go, Krishnamurti is the reincarnation of Christ. You know this story?
The main thing I've read a little bit of Krishnamurti.
Okay.
The main thing I understand from this story is that his passing away really just disturbed, or not disturbed, but it destabilized everything because he didn't leave anything.
I see. So the point being is that this was, really, really the opposite of what Steiner talked about. And he felt even dangerous and nuts, okay, that they were doing this. But I think, in a way that they saw Steiner's influence growing at such an exponential rate that they were just trying to rock the boat. I don't know. I know that sounds trivial and that kind of thing. But a group around Steiner then wrote a letter to Besant because of the outrageousness of claiming that Krishnamurti was the reincarnation of Christ. And it was really, I think, such a brusque letter that she then expelled Steiner and that whole branch of them from the Theosophical Society. They were expelled. And it took, sadly, it took Krishnamurti, a long time to finally, admit I'm not the Christ reincarnated. Sorry, I mean, the whole thing to me is a farce, frankly. No offense, and I read Krishnamurti as a kid, but again, beautiful phrases, beautiful sentences by somebody. But show me the money, man, and he can't. He can't either, but the gurus are, about something else, I think, than what Steiner was about in that sense. So that's when then Steiner officially inaugurated, I think it was in 1912 or maybe it was 1913, January, somewhere in there, inaugurated the Anthroposophical Society. And many of the groups that have been theosophical and in the Netherlands and in Germany and many places in Europe then moved over to his way of seeing things. So that's theosophy then. Now, theosophy, again, I think that maybe with Steiner, to me, Blavatsky and all that stuff came along as a foundation for the real thing. James, and here I go, right? This is a sycophant talking now, right? The real thing, and that was Steiner. It was all there, so Steiner could talk about what could be talked about and begin really a massive transformation of culture in the world. It's only 100 years, right? And everything he did is already worldwide, and it's just still got to dig its way deeper into the understanding we have. That's my picture of it, right? And I can easily be persuaded I'm wrong.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So why? I mean, just as a little aside, why do you think it was? Do you think that same sort of your theory on they were trying to rock the boat and they saw Steiner's popularity? Do you think that's maybe the primary reason that theosophy, if you agree with me on this, that theosophy did die out as it did?
Well, it seems to me that's a pretty embarrassing story to have to saddle as a part of your history, right? So there's that. But I don't know if there really was a spiritual stream there anymore after Blavatsky. It kept going. I don't know if she really got down to business in terms of giving a set of careful exercises that people would then use to develop their own cognition and begin this path, which I think takes more than a lifetime. Everybody's really wanting clairvoyance. And I think it's more about us just, reorienting ourselves away from a pure materialistic orientation toward the world and starting to comprehend the nature of the etheric world and the astral world and what the ego really is and the hierarchies of beings, and at least begin to contemplate those ideas and see if they're true. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And she didn't give any of that. She did something amazing. I am not dismissing that at all, but she poured out all this esoteric wisdom from someplace, and it was astonishing. And it really did blow the world's mind for a while. But there were things in it that were erratic, and Steiner gave a lot of lectures on her. And where her upbringing, and again, for many reasons, one being a woman being shortchanged in that way culturally, that her grounded cultural life left her erratic in some ways, and that appeared in her spiritual visions. So things were distorted here and there, blah, 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 and Steiner goes into that a lot. But he's very respectful of her in many ways, at the same time that he's not just blindly, worshiping her and that kind of thing either. But there wasn't really anybody after her. So there's that. And you know what? That's how anthroposophy is too. There's really been no one after Rudolf Steiner, but he established these institutions in the world that are fundamentally esoterically based. Mm-hmm. And so when people enter into being a Waldorf teacher, if they're doing it correctly, here I go being a big shot here, if they're doing it correctly, they're taking on a spiritual path. Mm-hmm. So his vocations that he developed end up becoming methods for your own spiritual development. In fact, you can't do your job unless you spiritually develop. So to be an agriculturalist, a biodynamic person, to be a medical doctor out of anthroposophical medicine, to be a Waldorf teacher out of pedagogy and stuff, and studying and meditating on your students at night when you go to bed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All these things are esoteric paths. So they have kind of, almost as an inertia, some might argue, have kept anthroposophy kind of developing, in my opinion.
Do you think there can be, the second person? Do you think there ever can be a lineage in that sense of, after someone like Steiner or Gurdjieff or Blavatsky passes away? Do you think there ever can be someone who in any way could replace, the original founder?
It's a really, really pregnant question, isn't it? I mean, I want to say that as time has gone on, I've realized the benefits I have from anthroposophy, from the sloppy, pathetic way I do the exercises, okay? Even that way has made an enormous difference in my life. Mm-hmm. But I can't compare it because I didn't not do it for 30 years. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So I went, really, I think that it's a beginning. And Steiner says the work that you do will, in fact, the fruits, however evanescent that you can experience them, they're there in your bodies, and in your next incarnation, they are preserved. They carry over. You will be evolving in these ways. Now, whether that's true, we'll come to find. but it makes sense that somebody needed to come along that was that extraordinary, that could plant the seeds, that could start to wake people up to not becoming completely trapped in the materialism that is so powerful in the world, right? And just want to kind of take over everything in us, as it were. And I think that's successful. I think that people are wrestling with what to do, and seeing the earth more and more as a living being, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And hopefully not from some spacey, flaky way. I'm not into that new age stuff at all. Okay. This is all real concrete for me. Okay. All right. So did I answer that question? So I think, yes, it's over lifetimes that we would look for these things to happen. And I don't know how healthy it even is for somebody nowadays to come along and know everything, and then everybody follow that person. Maybe Steiner was almost one of the last ones of that. And we've grown up enough now that we've just got to take this on through whatever kind of vocation we take on. I'm going to be a person that does biodynamic agriculture seriously my whole life. I'm going to be a Waldorf teacher my whole life and work at this as best I can, et cetera, et cetera. And that will bear fruit.
No, I think that's a really great answer to it, to be fair. So there's still so much to touch upon. But I mean, as we've mentioned it almost as a piece in the chronology after the theosophical stuff, as you say, as he becomes secretary, he's giving that first talk on Anthroposophy. What is it?
Yeah, I don't know what it was on. I never got, it was there's a biography by a man named Lindenberg. It's a pretty good biography, my favorite. And I can't say it's the best because there's probably so many in German, we don't even know what they are. But this was a German one translated. And that's all he says. He gave a talk on Anthroposophy that evening just to show that he never really kind of was a theosophist. He wasn't going to join. And they said, well, you have to join. He said, well, I'm not going to pay dues. So he had a love-hate relationship with it, but those were going to be the people that were going to listen to him. So he had to go there, is the way I see it.
So what is, and what was, maybe it's changed a little, Anthroposophy? So
for Steiner, I mean, it really, in a way, is to me, the highest form of humanism. And that is that our science, and, I'm trying to remember the scientists who've argued this, but some have, we've had to sort of strip the human being out of the picture that we have of nature in the world. And it's given us a certain kind of objectivity, and we've really done this astonishing discovery of the forces and interrelationships of everything in the world. And we look out and we've got the whole science and biology and everything, but the human being is kind of not there. And you talk about the human being, we don't have a very clear picture of what the heck we are. We're mostly, right, an animal. We're just an extension of the animal kingdom. That's kind of the best we can do. And so Steiner goes, it's astonishing. We can't heal the earth. We can't find a harmonious way of living until we reincorporate the human being, fundamentally understanding the world with the human being in it. And that's my picture of humanism, right? And so he then said that, what is anthroposophy? Anthroposophy is through discovering the spirituality in the human being, then from that, discovering the spirituality of the cosmos. So through us, we will re-understand the cosmos in a new way, just like kind of the way we were talking about thinking, right? Arising in us and all that. When I mentioned that earlier, that's kind of seeing the human being back in the picture in a way, right? Where we aren't in the picture very much. Now it's and it's not much of a definition actually, but I don't have it quite exactly as I want to say it, but maybe it'll come back to me. But through the wisdom in the human being, discovering the wisdom in the cosmos again. Maybe that's a better way of saying it than spirituality.
And in this, it's sort of, there is a synthesis of many elements. I mean, science and spirituality loosely is the synthesis that is happening. The combination of these two for something bigger. And in this sense, do you feel that anything can get lost in the sense once they're combined, certain factors of each get lost? You've spoken about this humanism. So really, there's obviously lots of parts, but you have this sort of scientific approach to it. You have the humanism. You have the spiritual development. And Do you think really for those things to, or for Steiner, for those things to become what they're meant to become, they need to be combined. They can't just be taken solely. So actually, they're damaging to themselves, being understood in their own vacuum.
Absolutely. I mean, we could say we don't understand. We have certain functional utilitarian, aspects of knowledge that we have. And look we're using them and we're just destroying the earth at a pretty rapid pace with these understandings we do have, right? So there isn't an understanding in an arguable sense unless we understand the human being also in relation to nature in a full, complete existential sense. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I don't know that's true, but I'm looking for an answer to what the heck we're doing to the planet, man. I mean, this is insane. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Was that for Steiner? Was that always a clear aim? A discussion regarding the planet, like not only in the like the cosmic terms, but in a very material health of the planet way.
Yes, very much so. Very, very much so. Not that necessarily his prescience talked about, global warming or climate change, let's call it that. But for instance, one of the things that was very obvious is when he gave the agriculture course, we're talking about, Upper Silesia, those parts of Europe where they had been farming a certain way for centuries, whereas in America, right, we hadn't been doing any of that yet. So they could really, really see the deterioration of the land and the illnesses and the pests and stuff that were getting worse and worse with every year. So there was a real ecological pregnancy to Steiner then giving the agricultural course there. And at that time, talking about how do we do this? How do we bring life back into something that we've been killing for a long time, right? Mm-hmm. And then it gave, all the homeopathic ways of building compost piles and all the different ways to do companion planting and all the ways that the planets and the sun in relation to the planets and the constellations are bringing qualitatively different forces to the earth that we have to acknowledge and understand and grow our plants in certain ways in relation to the cosmos. And all that is astonishing. Many argue that if you ever wanted to read the most esoteric thing Steiner read the agriculture lectures.
Why? Because he's sort of still hiding his esoteric stuff within those very practical lectures?
Well, I think because he has to say all these things about the world that are esoteric, that just to explain how agriculture has to be done. Whereas in other things, he could, he didn't have to saturate it with so much esoteric content, spiritual content, shall we? I don't know if I'm saying that right, but maybe I made that sound weird, but yeah. But, like he's, anyway. And I don't, honestly, I've recorded them but they're very overwhelming. I mean, they're quite something, but the greatest wines in the world are grown biodynamically, which he would cringe, I think, at, and also Demeter, you're over there. I don't know. Do you guys get Demeter products in England? You've seen those?
So, yeah.
Little bits here and there. Very, very highly respected. All those plants that are used for Dr. Hauschka products and for Valeda and Vala and Uriel Pharmacy and all these other pharmacies then take biodynamically grown plants and process them in the way Steiner indicated to preserve their vital etheric and life forces as much as possible. And so they're all extremely respected in the world.
So what point, I'll sort of combine a couple of questions, I guess. One thing that always interests me with, I think this is my Englishness coming through with everything I approach, which is, all right, but what's your, not the point, but what's your goal? Where are we going? What's the aim? So that's one question, but combined with, at what point does Anthroposophy become the Waldorf form of education? Or is this all wrapped together, that Steiner always understood that any spiritual system or esoteric system or system of this kind, using the word system there very precariously, would that always have to be something that became something which educated? Was that the goal? And the goal in itself is just a continual goal of education.
Wow. Yeah. So first of all, Waldorf Education, in a way, doesn't have anything directly to do with Anthroposophy, right? Mm-hmm. In a way, that's a path of knowledge that the teachers would use. And then Waldorf is then another set of ideas Steiner gave first of all, he was a teacher and had been a practical teacher for almost all his life, as we've talked about. Mm-hmm. And then incorporating this bigger picture of the human being with an etheric body and an astral body and an ego and all these things. And they're part of an educational system too. So all that is a picture that they take on, and they don't know it's true, right? They take it on as a working model, as a working hypothesis, because there's something that when you see in a Waldorf school, it's just astonishing. It's so human. If you're wondering what human looks like when it comes back into the picture, go to a good Waldorf school, because there's obviously a lot of them that have had to suffer with a lot of vicissitudes over the time that they exist. Okay, your question was almost too complex for me. So let's just say that. Now, are we kind of talking about teleology here?
I think so.
Okay,
yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So how fast to take that? So right now, you could say, Steiner would say that in this part of evolution, the human ego is actually kind of evolving. It's trying to come into being. And this is then saying, right, implying that the human ego really didn't exist in the past. In the time of the Egyptians, the self was really a self with others, right? Mm-hmm. We've talked about that a little bit. And the fall, as the Bible says, that moment when the human being realized it was naked, right, is in fact the time when the ego began to wake up. And the Hebrew people are a very special case in this that Steiner spends a lot of time on. We won't go into that right now. But this nakedness then gradually happened all over the world as people gradually woke up to a sense of self more and more and more. Okay, and that's an amazing story of Steiner's, right? So that's still being born, that sense of self, because what's that going to look like? Well, I mean, I think of it as that sharp sword that the Christ talks about, and I come to bring a sword, which is kind of separates things and it splits things up at the same time that it gives you a strength and a focus and an ability to do something you couldn't do without it, in that sense. And that is in an evolutionary stage, and after that stage, after the ego is shall we say fully born, then there'll be another organism that will incorporate itself into the human being in evolution. So yes, there is an ongoing evolution that goes on for a long time, and it has been going on for a long time, far longer, frankly, than I think we could even say that the time that the universe has existed in a certain way, right? Because that's only the physical part of it. So I don't know where to go with that. I have some things I thought about, and I don't know if they're just nutsy.
Go ahead. So unleash.
Okay. Yeah, you're ready for me. Yeah. I think I've worn you down now. Okay, so we do have to talk about this for a second. So one of the things I loved that I read when I was reading Steiner is in the second chapter, The Nature of Humanity, in the book An Outline of Occult Science, or An Outline of Esoteric Science, one of his basic books. He talks about the human being. He says, look, we've got this physical body, and we look at the mineral realm, and there it is. We're so thankful that the mineral kingdom exists because it's given us this heritage of having a physical body, right? Mm-hmm. And here it is. Well, that's interesting. This physical body, it's always dying. I'm losing all these cells all the time, hundreds of thousands of cells, a minute or an hour? I always forget that number. Or just substance. I'm just losing substance all the time, and I'm replacing that substance all the time, right? And so Steiner says, well, that's not coming from the mineral kingdom. The mineral kingdom is not replacing your substance. The mineral king, if you were just a mineral body, you're just decay to the fundamental substances you're composed of. That's what you would do. But something else is present that is actively involved in replacing the substances that the mineral kingdom is dying away in you. Okay. And so he looks at the plant kingdom. He says, yes, look at the plant kingdom. We see there another set of forces. He calls them cosmic forces that have penetrated matter, raised it to a higher organization, given it a whole different relationship to its environment. And it is constantly replacing these substances. And you have one of those bodies. He calls it an etheric body. And you can thank the plant realm, shall we say, as a kingdom of nature for that heritage of having that life body, just like you can your physical body and the mineral kingdom. But in our life body, which is far more advanced, is where our life of memory resides. It's the roots of where our thinking life arises out of. So many things are happening there that are far, a big story, but let's just say that. So then we look, well, what happens next? Well, now I'm not just alive, but I'm also sentient. I have these organs of perception in my physical body that are pouring this data into my being, and I'm experiencing it inwardly. I have pleasure, I have pain, I have passions. Well, plants, people will argue it does, but there's no way to see that phenomenologically. You have to use a machine or make something up in your head about it. But I can clearly see it in the animal realm. Pain, pleasure, sentience, drives, passions, all this stuff is happening in them. And it's happening in us. So again, we look at the plant animal realm, and there's a set of forces he calls astral forces, or the astral world, or you could call them consciousness forces, that are penetrating us from the cosmos. And now we have these three bodies in relation to the mineral kingdom and the plant kingdom and the animal kingdom. And then he says, but you stand upright, you speak, you have all these capacities that the animal realm doesn't have. And it's always an arguable thing to get to this next kingdom. But he's saying, and this is the human kingdom. And those are arising because of a reincarnating spiritual individuality that is using earthly existence for the purposes of its evolution. Okay?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So that's a picture of the human being, as Steiner says, that has to be taken. So he uses that picture of the human being to create an educational system. He uses that picture of the human being to talk about how to create proper agricultural products. He uses, believe it or not. So it's amazing how all these, and he uses it also, really cool, to talk about how the evolution of consciousness has occurred, because at certain times we weren't really accessing our consciousness through the brain. We were, in Egyptian times, we were accessing it through the liver, right? Which was considered the focus of consciousness. I don't know if you know that, right? They threw the brain away. They didn't think it had any use whatsoever, things like that, which is fascinating. Why? How could that be, right? Well, these bodies were in a different relationship to each other, which resulted in a completely different experience of the world than we have, that you and I have. It's a quite amazing story, right? Okay, so here we are. I'm still in the teleological aspect. Okay, so how can we see at least what we're doing right now? Now, I love this story, and that is the story of these. Okay, now that's still not enough yet. Yeah. Okay, so here we go. So, okay, so let's look at child development. So here we are. So every 7 years of your life, your etheric body, Steiner claims, replaces all the substances in your organism. So every 7 years, you have a completely new organism in terms of the substances that are in it. So you're really like a river. You're like a river of cells. You have a new pancreas about every 24 hours. All the cells are replaced. You have a liver about every 7 days. All the incredibly lively organ, and it changes all. It just secretes all the old cells and substances and replaces them. So our bodies, we look at them and we think they're these permanent things. That's a magnificent illusion. Okay. Mm-hmm. You're a river. Every 7 years I walk and go, hey, James, there's not a single spot of your organism that's the same as it was 7 years ago. And yet I still recognize who you are, you know what I mean, kind of thing, right? Mm-hmm. And so every 7 years, Steiner says, there's this magnificent change in the human being. So you're born. For the first 7 years of your life, your etheric body, which is incredibly powerful then, replaces all the substances you got from your parents. So by the time you're 7, roughly, again, these are, depending on the culture, changes this and stuff. Around 7, you've gotten rid of all the substances you got from your parents. And the last thing you get rid of is the hardest substance you got from your parents, which is your baby teeth. And when you start pushing your baby teeth out, Steiner says a clairvoyant can see the etheric body change, and a part of it sort of differentiates off around the head region. And it causes, this is organismic, right? Or organic. It causes a qualitative leap in the nature of the consciousness of the child. It sort of becomes, this is my phrase, kind of a morally saturated pictorial consciousness. And you tell it stories, and it just generates images and has these enormous feelings of good and evil when those stories are told, that it just saturates its soul. And do you remember that time in our lives when that was like that? We never have that experience again, like we had when stories were told. So in Waldorf Education, you pull the glove inside out, you take all the knowledge you want to supposedly transfer to the child, but you clothe it in these stories so that you preserve the nature of consciousness the child has at that time for as long as you can. But in our educational system, I was an educator all my life, we try to strip out that childlike consciousness and turn them into adults as fast as we possibly can. Mm-hmm. To straw man the argument, just to make the contrast the argument, right? And Steiner says, when you do that, when you call upon the intellectual faculties prematurely, you're robbing these etheric forces, because they'll go there. They'll generate intellectuality for you, but they'll rob the organism of its growth qualities. And it will actually incorporate disease structures, lesions, let's call them, in the etheric body that will result in illnesses when you're 40 or 50 or 60 years old. So this is interesting, right? That somebody to claim this, right? So in Waldorf Education, you have this whole different intention that's going on. So from 7 to 14, you have another 7-year period. The body changes out all its substances again, and son of a gun, isn't there again a massive change in the organism, mm-hmm. called puberty, called formal operations thinking, called this bone structure takes off like crazy and you grow like a weed, all that kind of stuff, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then you teach in a different way, because now the human being is trying to become logical, and so you have to approach it in a very different way. And this is all, shall we say, informed by an anthroposophical understanding of the human being.
So Dale, well, just to add to that, I'm a bit concerned now because I just turned 28. So where am I? What's about to happen?
Man, I wish I was as far along as you were when I was 28. You just made me feel bad. I was 65. All right. So then, now it becomes more subtle, right? And we'll go into this, but Steiner said these organismic changes, these biological transformations of consciousness, we could call them, right, at 7 and 14, in the way past, in the times of the Indian culture, thousands of years ago, these continued all the way up into their 50s. Mm-hmm. Every 7 years, there would be a massive change in the consciousness of the human being, which doesn't occur anymore. Isn't that fascinating? He says, we are kind of getting younger and younger and younger. There's a part of our being that's going backwards in time. So here we'll get to that. So now from 14 to 21, again, another 7-year period. Again, the substances of the bodies have been changed out. Now this starts to change a little bit, right? As we get older, our life forces aren't as powerful. So these time periods become looser, right? In the early years, they're pretty much closer, but now our bodies are more tired, our etheric forces are getting more exhausted. So maybe we don't change them all out in 7 years, kind of thing, right? Kind of thing, just so we don't get too dogmatic about that. Mm-hmm. So then he says, really what's happened is that when you were born, your physical body was unsheathed. He uses this phrase from your mother. When you were 7, your etheric body was unsheathed and became an independent part of your organism. When you're 14, your astral body, which has been sheathed all this time, is unsheathed, and it becomes an independent part of your organism. So now at 21, the ego is born. Steiner says you're really not born on the earth until you're 21. Wow. And when that is done, the ego is unsheathed, and it immediately, this is why I had to do this, because we were going to talk about teleology. We're still doing that. So the ego then immediately turns upon its astral body. And as the morals, as our spiritual part, as our moral agency, it wants to transform the astral body into something eternal. And it tries to ennoble the astral body. And it does that by reaching out in relation to other human beings. It wants to enter into relationship with other human beings. It wants to become independent now with its 3 independent bodies and go out into the world and live a life. And so from 21 to 28, Steiner described that period as the period of the sentient soul development. Where sentience, this reading the outer world, and the soul living in that relationship and trying to learn, right? Just learn what it can. How well has it been educated up to that time? How much will that allow it to reach with a more powerful purchase, shall we say, into existence? That's a question, right? That's education in a nutshell, I think, right? So then from 28 to 35, the ego actually tries to enter into a relationship with the etheric body, which is much, shall we say, denser and harder to influence. Our astral body is sentience. It's awareness, right? We jump around in that world pretty easily, and we probably get a lot done. Who knows? It depends how distracted we are, right? But the etheric body is different. It's where our temperament lies. It's where the deep characterological dispositions of our nature have sort of cemented themselves from whatever internalizations occurred when we were kids. But Steiner says, well, how would you influence that world? Okay, so how would you transform that? He says, well, rhythm. He says, in a word, rhythm does that. So for instance, in a religious life of some kind, and he doesn't care what it is, as long as there's some kind of religious life in a rhythmic fashion, you will begin to affect the etheric body's development, the purifying it. He says, but working on the etheric body is like an hour hand of a clock, whereas working on the astral body is like the minute hand of a clock. Kind of, I love that image. And that's from 28 to 35. He calls that the intellectual or mind soul preparation time, development time. And it's a part of our soul we're actually growing during that period from 28 to 35. So get busy, James. and then from 35 to 42, the human being's ego actually tries to touch the physical body, but not the gross matter from the mineral kingdom, but the physical forces. And that's more subtle. Let's think of them as, I've always struggled with this, but they're probably like our nuclear forces in our atoms or something. You know what I mean? They're not etheric forces. They're physical forces, but they're still spiritual in nature, but they're very, very high. The physical body in its spiritual nature is higher in a way than all of our bodies, which is quite amazing to think about. And, and that is only beginning, but it's interesting existentially that during that time from 35 to 42 is a time where you have midlife crises, where the idea of death begins to sort of impact unconsciousness in a new way, as we know from Gail Sheehy's books or Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's books, etc. Right? That there's this developmental consciousness thing that happens, and that's very interesting. And it's neat that Steiner, years before any of that was ever discussed by anybody, talks about this gesture of the ego to touch the physical body and, give it a shot at trying to transform it, right? That's a big step way in the future. Okay. So these are teleological aspects of us. Mm-hmm. Now, ultimately, these three things become the completely purified astral body of passions and instincts will become something Steiner called the spirit self. The completely transformed etheric body will become something eternal called a part of our organism, just like the ego is becoming a part of our organism now, becomes something called life spirit, or buddhi in the ancient theosophical terms. And then even eventually the physical body, when it's completely transformed, will be called spirit human being or spirit man, or atma as it's called in the ancient thing. So all that, let me tell you now the story of our teleology. What's that take? Okay. And that is the three Easters in the story of the mystery of Golgotha. Give us a picture of all of this, the three Easters. And these three Easters are when they saw Jesus walking on the water. Steiner says they were seeing the clairvoyance that was burgeoning in the apostles. They were seeing the completed transformation of our astral body to the end of this period of our human evolution. And it was a spirit self experience for them. So they were seeing this spirit self manifesting as though it was like walking on the water. Then on Mount Tabor, when they see Jesus clothed in this luminous white garb, they were seeing the completely transformed etheric body of the human being all the way to the end of evolution, and had become life spirit, this new part of our nature that we'll have then. And then finally, the mystery of Golgotha itself and the death on the cross and the resurrection then is a picture of even the physical body being transformed all the way to spirit human being.
Wow.
There you, okay, and it all fits, isn't it weird how it fits?
No, it fits.
That's
man.
what just you're going. Wait a sec. The Bible has got all this, and Steiner says actually the Bible needs to be taken absolutely literally. Except you and I don't have the key for that literalism. We use our materialistic sequential thinking, and we read it like a damn newspaper. You know what I mean? And it isn't, and it is, but it's a newspaper for an initiate. An initiate can read it like a newspaper. You and I have to try and imagine what's being said there, right? In the richest sense of the word. And that's really one of the great horrors of our time. Is the misuse of scriptures in general, probably not even just, but the Hebrew is very special because of the way it was written with a certain linearity that we really experience strongly in our time. So it's a long story.
Yeah, I mean, but so do you consider Steiner an initiate?
Well, we would have to say that. He never ever says that of himself, but he does talk about initiates and seems pretty much one of them. But yes. I mean, if I'm going to look at this whole picture, and now we're just kind of my own opinions, right? Yes, I see Steiner as the great initiate of the modern age. I think he's the greatest initiate so far that we know of. Now, I think there are many that just stayed out of the picture, and I think it was a great sacrifice at any time for an initiate to step into the public life.
Yeah,
and really, get hammered, because he sure did. You know what I mean? They burned down the Goetheanum. I mean, that was arson. So,
wow. So you think many people who are of the initiates generally just stick to a personal evolution?
Well, not so much personal, see, because then what's happening is they work in the spiritual sphere. So Steiner said, somebody asked him, the man, when Steiner was asked to help with a new understanding of a Christian ritual that then became what is now the worldwide Christian church, but they don't use the word church, Christian community. It's called the Christian Community Movement for Religious Renewal, which is now practiced all over the world. It uses the 7 sacraments, but everything's been changed by Steiner. But he did not found it. But the guy that came along and was sort of the beginning of it all, his name was Friedrich Riddlemeyer. He said, well, what about initiates in our day, Dr. Steiner? What would that be like? He goes, well, you wouldn't know them. He says they could be a doorman at a hotel. Mm-hmm. So everything they're doing is being done with great effect, I'm going to argue, with great efficaciousness, but in a spiritual way in the world. Mm-hmm. I right out off the bat, I'm thinking of the angels in Wings of Desire. You ever see that movie?
No.
Oh, Wim Wenders. Give it a look. Everybody listening, watch that show. Very, very beautiful. Bruno Ganz is in it, and it's a great classic from the 70s, 60s, maybe. I don't even know. Maybe 80s. I could be wrong.
Yeah, I'll have to give it a look. But I mean, I want to touch on something that you mentioned about, so the idea of an initiate, taking that risk of putting themselves in the public eye and then teaching and knowing they're going to get hammered, as you say. It's a question that's come up on the podcast many, many times in relation to many thinkers who are forgotten. But Steiner is, of course, one of the big ones. And he hasn't been forgotten as much, but his memory is, could we say, contained. And why do you think, perhaps at the time and now is the same reasons, such people are sidelined, if not just immediately criticized?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, let's say this. I mean, Steiner is the best kept secret of the 21st century. Nobody knows who Steiner is in relation to all he's produced and is active in the world, right? Mm. He's completely virtually no person in a Waldorf school knows that Steiner exists. It's pretty amazing. So let's just throw that out. It's kind of fascinating. I mean, when he was alive, yes, probably more of an awareness and like you say. So I just wanted to that's my opinion on that. Okay. Mm-hmm. So yes, well, if we're going to have a world such as we now consider to be the real world, which is a pretty completely materialistic world with some kind of compartmentalized religious life out there, for whatever it's worth, and I don't think very much, frankly. It scares the heck out of me. Mm. Okay, that's the world. That's our world. That's how our the formation of our conceptual life, our consciousness, everything runs on the world is this way. Well, and then along comes Steiner. I mean, come on, he's got to be nuts. He's got to be a kook. right? Nobody could be this way. I mean, read the anecdotes about the guy to blow your mind when he would, people would be ill or something. And the way he would, for example, okay, just to give you an idea. So whenever the doctors, as time went on, whenever the doctors found Steiner was going to be in one darn place for more than a day or two, because he was roaming around Europe all the time giving lectures, so let's say when he was giving the agriculture course, oh my God, Steiner's going to be in the same place for 2 weeks. They would take all their problem cases as doctors, and they would go there. And Steiner would they would all get in a room, and Steiner would use it as a teaching moment. They'd bring, let's say, a child in. Steiner would look at the child for 5 minutes. The child would leave the room, and Steiner would then give his medical assessment of the difficulties of the child and blow their minds. Okay. And then like one time I loved, some woman, her child was having trouble, and he said, I need to speak to the mother. So the mother comes in, and Steiner says, so could you tell me about an occurrence that happened in the 4th month of your pregnancy? And she tells him, he goes, yes, I see now. Okay, thank you. And then she leaves. Then he continues the conversation. So there was this whole modality, Steiner's phenomenological panorama that he was then being scientific about, right? The data that he was getting was coming from, and we haven't mentioned this before, all of our bodies have organs of perception. So obviously our physical body does. The organ of perception of our ego is thinking, but we have organs of perception in our etheric body that see the life world absolutely existentially directly. We have organs of perception in our astral body that see the world of the astral world phenomenologically directly. So once you've awakened all those organs and are able to receive data from those organs, then your thinking life can integrate it and understand your world. So think of Steiner's world with all those organs of perception active. Am I making sense?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
That's an initiate. That right there in a nutshell is what an initiate is a person who's simply awake on all those levels. So they look into a human being and they're seeing all this stuff going on. But most of the time, who knows how well their own education is in terms of integrating it into something understandable that can be communicated to other people. That was Steiner's raison d'être. That's the great deed of his, was that he could take spiritual concepts and bring them down with enough accuracy that people could think about them and not think he was nuts. Well, some anyway. I think I digressed there. Did I lose my way?
No. I mean, it's a tough question, and really, I think the answer is somewhat self-evident, especially in relation to the material world. As you say, it doesn't want to do anything, and it's developed a language which immediately isn't critical in the sense that it's actually going to work with this stuff and try prove that it's wrong. It just goes, it's a load of nonsense, right? For instance, I recently had a discussion with someone about near-death experiences on the podcast, and their work was they were going to enter into a debate with Steven Pinker about near-death experiences, and he said, "Well, this is all connected to parapsychology and clairvoyance, so it's all nonsense. So there's no point doing the debate, right?" Exactly. So immediately they're like they've quashed any form of discussion about it because it's already wrong because it isn't us. Which is bad science, it's bad philosophy, it's bad everything. But there you go. It's certainly comfortable for them to be able to do that.
Yeah, well said, and thank you. We got back to the question. Now I remember. Yes, very much so, right? I mean, it's dismissed, right? And sadly enough, right, considering the way religions have acted in the last, few millennia, it's just darn sad. In a way, we're glad we're out of that mess, except we don't seem to be. Here we are, still killing everybody and each other, but so there's that's a good one. Yeah. And it's immediately dismissed. So that's what's kind of cool about anthroposophy in a way, is that some people come and they walk into a Waldorf school. Well, wait a sec, what's going on here? And then they ask the question, right? And then people can say things and they go, oh, well, gee, it sure looks like something. I better study this, even though it would be nuts any other way it was approached, right? Agriculture. My God, this is amazing what you guys are getting here. How does this work? Well, it's because of blah, blah, blah. Oh, I think I'll look into that, right? So that's the other fascinating side of it all. And again, I think why an initiate had to bring the highest spiritual concepts completely down and penetrate the physical world with them. and all these healing cultural movements arise out of that are starting to persuade. It's only been 100 years, James. That's nothing, right? That's nothing. In 400, 500 years, I think it's going to be pretty amazing. Or we won't be here. I'm afraid to say it's probably going to be one or the other. Well, we'll be here. I don't think you can actually just kill the whole thing off, but you could sure give the earth an amazing amount of suffering. And, coming back from it will, be a long time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one sort of final question I guess I have for you, because as you said at the start, this idea actually that I really like of, does anyone know Steiner? I mean, we know of him, but then you go, yeah, but look at everything he did. Do you really know him? Maybe this is a really tough question. Where should someone begin with Steiner?
That's the side of it that's always hard. And part of it, I've always wanted to say, there's two ways to go about it. One would be to read a secondary biography of Steiner by someone else that gives you an overview, and you can decide whether you're going to take or leave him, right? Or if you're already a teacher or a farmer or a bee keeper or a doctor or a dancer from Eurythmy or an architect or a painter, and I can go on, you could study one of his lecture cycles in those particular areas, possibly, and see if, because there could be terminology difficulties too, and see if you find your way to him that way. Or if you're just a generalist like I was, you could start with, or philosophy, that's what I did, right? That's how I landed him, was the Philosophy of Freedom. The next book, An Outline of Occult Science or An Outline of Esoteric Science, really does give a nutshell of anthroposophy in a wondrous, profound, intense way. Did you ever get a chance to read that book?
No, not yet.
Okay. And that's a ride. That's a ride. That's really quite something. And a lot of people, that would be one, if you're, really open and ready to read about those ideas, because then you get all the terminology created as he's developing the conceptual framework. Yeah.
Wow. And where can we find your work?
So I'm on www.rudolfsteineraudio.com. And that's completely free. You don't have to sign up with all that email stuff. Drives me nuts. You just dive right on in there and grab whatever you want. I also have it as a streaming service now, but I don't have it all on there, and it's very poorly organized. It's called rudolfsteiner.podbean.com. And you need to put the collected works volume in there and Steiner's name, and then it'll give you the list of it. It's a podcast site. It's really not built for books. You know what I mean? So it's a little messy that way. And then while I was posting on the Podbean site, I had it just linked to Spotify, and I had it linked to Apple iTunes, and I had it linked to YouTube. So I do have a channel on YouTube that's sort of after the fact. I don't pay a lot of attention to it, but people apparently like YouTube, and so they do that. And then it's a longer story, but I'll just say this, that the work was also taken on by Rudolf Steiner Press.com in England, and they now have a website called Rudolf Steiner Press Audio, which is my stuff that's on YouTube, and that's pretty comprehensive. I think that might have everything that's the main site, rudolfsteineraudio.com, has everything, and the other sites have not everything. They have just, there's little pieces missing, because I'm a little erratic that way.
Wow.
And there's other places. There's a guy, Karma Police Bureau is his name. And he did this was about 10 years ago. He took some of the lectures he really liked, and he did these meticulous montages that as the lecture's being read, he uses images. Like he'll do the Egyptian myths and mysteries. And when it's talking about a certain thing, he finds an Egyptian image that fits what's being talked about. And they're meticulous. And they're high res and everything. I don't know how long a person would ever want to stare at one of those, but they're pretty amazing. He's had those for a long time. And there's probably other things here and there, around. I don't even know how many downloads a year it is now. It's very gratifying, and I just love getting letters from people and gabbing, as you can see, about Steiner's work. Right? I haven't even got halfway through the notes I got ready for you, but well, if you need to leave, I understand.
No, it's not a question of needing to leave. It's about keeping it within a time. So but I was going to say, I would love to chat again, though maybe that's a risk, me saying that, because I'm sure you'd happily talk about Steiner forever. And I mean, this is the thing. I mean, I do these episodes and I think, man, I just wanna spend all my time with Steiner. I mean, I've already got an episode planned for someone else for Steiner's Christology, his work on the Gospels, which is absolutely fascinating, and Christianity is mystical fact, and these beautiful books. So if you're up for it, I'm more than happy to chat about Steiner, once again.
That'd be great. Well, thank you so much. Really, it's such a pleasure and honor. And I really have listened to a episode and a half on your site, and how wonderful what you're doing. And now to know you're 28, well, there's great times to come.
Thanks very much. So Dale Brunsvold, thank you.